Western liberals think that they are the world. In fact, they once made a song about it during the famine in sub-Saharan Africa. "We are the world," sang the pompadoured and pampered pop stars in London. The problem is they truly believe it. For them, there is no Asia. For them, there is no Latin America. For them, there is no rest of the world. And above all, perhaps, for them, there is no Africa, even though Africa is where it all began, and even though Africa is quite the richest continent in the whole world. And in fact, if you were to poll 100 people on your street today, 99% of them would never have heard of the BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And yet, most of the world and most of the wealth of the world is in these two organizations. It is quite extraordinary the extent to which Western European liberals, whether they're in North America or still in the European continent, have no idea about the global issues and the extent to which the balance of power and wealth in the world has decisively shifted. Only 13% of the population of the world actually live in what they call the West, although the FT has now expelled the United States of America from the West on account of the possible abandonment of Zelensky and Ukraine by the United States government. So that 13% is now even less. And when it comes to the children of the world, only 7% of the world's children actually live in what they call the West. The BRICS, at whose summit I was in Kazan in Russia just a few months ago, is where the sun is rising. Trump, however, is not unaware of the challenge represented by these new global behemoths that have suddenly hoved into his view. In fact, you can tell that by the number of times he's been threatening them. Tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. That's the new Russia, Russia, Russia in the Trump administration. He has warned the people of the BRICS that if they dare seek to bypass the dollar, he'll put 100% tariffs on their exports to the United States, even though most of them export virtually nothing to the United States. Sometimes it's 150%. Trying to replace the dollar with a new financial system could earn you 200% tariffs levied by President Donald Trump. There's no doubt that threatening tariffs is not the only trick in the book. It's not the only club in Donald Trump's golf bag. He will try to divide the BRICS. And now that the BRICS is much wider than it used to be, obviously, by definition, dividing them is much easier than it used to be. You've come to the right place to discuss these and other matters. It's Have It Out with Galloway. Na'eem Jeenah is a senior researcher at the Mapungubwe Institute based in Johannesburg, South Africa, former director of the Afro-Middle East Center in that country and a member of the advisory board of the Center for Africa-China Studies and vice president of the Dennis Hurley Peace Institute. He's also a member of the advisory board of the World Congress for Middle Eastern Studies and has authored, amongst others, the book titled Pretending Democracy, Israel, an Ethnocratic State. Na'eem, welcome to Have It Out with Galloway. I'm right, am I not, that Trump at least, even if not every American, is well aware of the challenge posed by BRICS?
Yes, that's correct. But I think in the main, that challenge is more economic than political. But he certainly is aware of it, and hence his repeated rhetoric and aggressive rhetoric, particularly about China, and as you said, the examples you gave about BRICS in general.
The economic challenge of BRICS is a real one, isn't it? It is, if not existential, it is a severe challenge to the United States hegemony.
It absolutely is. I mean, China, for example, the richest member, or the member of BRICS with the largest economy, is set to probably in the next decade be the largest or have the largest economy in the world. India is following not too far behind, another member of BRICS. And so between these two, the economic challenge to the United States is huge. While the U.S. economy is not doing as well, not as great, spending huge amounts of money on the military complex, for example. But this kind of challenge. So on the one hand, there's this fact about the size of these economies, but on the other, it's a challenge to American hegemony in terms of the role that the dollar plays. Of course, I mean there's no intention by BRICS members right now to replace the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. But there's already a process that has begun, or incidents that have begun, of certain BRICS countries trading with each other in their own currencies, and so kind of bypassing the dollar. That begins to pose a challenge to the dollar hegemony, and therefore the hegemony of the United States globally in terms of its economic muscle.
It doesn't sound terribly radical, does it? Countries choosing to trade with each other in their own currency rather than change their own currency into dollars in order to facilitate the dollar hegemony. And yet at Kazan, there was definitely disappointment in the air that not more progress was made on ideas that were vogue only 12 months before, of an alternative to the SWIFT system, an alternative to the dollar altogether, maybe even a BRICS currency.
To a large extent, these kinds of, particularly the issue of the dollar as the reserve currency, these kinds of issues are dictated within BRICS by BRICS' largest economy, which is China. And China is not keen right now to have the dollar replaced as the reserve currency. They hold huge reserves in dollars. One might say, in a kind of slang kind of way, that China owns the United States. So it's not to its benefit right now to change the reserve currency. In the long term, that is what is going to happen. And China, of course, plays a long game, and that's ultimately where we will end up. But the challenge right now is, as I said, it's also a challenge of power. And so the United States not being able to control how people trade with each other, but also it weakens the American power in terms of things like sanctions, etc. If you're not trading with each other with the dollar, then your trade and transactions, etc., are not going via the United States in a sense, and that reduces their power over how these countries operate the economies, how they trade, how they do business with each other, etc. So it's only partly in terms of the whole money and economic issue, but and partly the political power that the US is able to wield as a result.
I was going to raise the issue of sanctions with you, in fact. Of course, it is an article of membership of BRICS that BRICS countries may not sanction each other. But the last time I looked, the United States is sanctioning a huge number, including South Africa, sanctioning a huge number of the members of BRICS. And whilst China is, of course, too big to sanction at the moment, the United States is refusing to give them their gold reserves back, which, very unwisely, they have stored in the United States. You'd think these lessons would be learned. And in response, China is selling US Treasury bonds. And insofar as China does own the US, there's still tremendous capacity for economic aggression there, isn't there?
Yes, certainly. And of course, the sanctions issue, even countries that are not sanctioned directly by the United States are affected by this. So, for example, two BRICS members, South Africa and Iran. Iran is heavily sanctioned, until recently, the most heavily sanctioned country in the world. That now is Russia. Heavily sanctioned. South Africa is not sanctioned by the United States, and South Africa has very good relations with Iran. But the trade relationship between South Africa and Iran is way below what one might expect. And the reason for that is, number one, it's difficult to trade with a country that's out of the SWIFT system. You have to find all kinds of creative ways in order to do that. And secondly, there's always the looming threat of secondary sanctions. So if you trade with a country that the US sanctions, the US could then impose certain sanctions on you. And that becomes the problem. And so even countries that are in the same family, the same BRICS family, have this problem of how to deal with American sanctions against other countries that are in the family. And this makes the whole sanctions regime highly problematic at a global level, and particularly, of course, for countries of the global south.
It screams out to me that an alternative to the SWIFT system is axiomatic, really, because even if you continue to use the dollar as a reserve currency, the fact that they can cut you off in this way through their control of SWIFT, when relatively easily an alternative could be produced. Can't China be persuaded of that somewhat obvious point?
I think it would require more than, I don't think that China would want to just jump into that on its own. So it would require more than one country to sign on to that. I do think that in the long term, that is what is going to happen. But BRICS countries are very careful about not upsetting the global apple cart, as it were. So we shouldn't romanticize the power and the role that BRICS plays. The one is the reserve currency, the SWIFT system, etc. In many ways, BRICS is playing within the game that has already been set and not wanting to create its own game. And we can, have our own critique of that. But part of the reason for that, of course, is that among the members of BRICS, so BRICS as a bloc is not an anti-Western bloc. It's not an anti-American bloc. I mean, in some of the members of BRICS includes, for example, India, which is firmly in the American camp, definitely not in the Chinese camp. It includes countries like Saudi Arabia, which until recently was very firmly in the American camp, and now is trying to play different sides. It includes a country like South Africa, whose second largest trading partner is the United States, and therefore wouldn't want to upset the United States, even though South Africa does push the envelope now and then. And so to create or to propose a kind of alternative system that upsets the system as it currently is, that is dictated by America and the American dollar, is not something that's going to happen overnight, because within this group, within this family, you have those who are actually closer to the US than they are to each other.
That's the tension, isn't it, between broadening the number of people in the BRICS and the BRICS having the capacity to actually do things that are meaningful. I don't want to adumbrate the names, but we all know there are countries inside BRICS, and you've just named some of them, who are deeply compromised insofar as BRICS has a purpose of ending anybody's hegemony. It's not against the United States per se, but it was supposed to be against the ability of superpowers to have hegemonic power over others. So, for example, if the only members of BRICS were Iran, Russia, and China, that would still be a gigantic chunk of the world's population, a gigantic chunk of the world's economy, and it would have the unity required to actually do something meaningful.
Yes, and of course, you know, with countries that are democracies, many BRICS states aren't democracies, but those that are, that can change from you know, from a few years to the next few years. Brazil, for example, with President Lula there at the helm, is very clear on many issues and politically on the same page as a country like South Africa or many other BRICS members. But just a few years ago, when it was headed by a United States proxy and thug, Jair Bolsonaro, then it wasn't on the same page. So even a single country can change from one time to another, and that makes that creates some kind of volatility within BRICS. But it also means that you can't make the assumption that all of the countries are politically on the same page. And how the bloc then moves forward together is not something that is always easily predictable. In fact, what you can predict is that it's very difficult for it to move forward together politically or to express politically the same kind of voice on various issues. I mean, one issue would be Palestine, for example. The second largest economy in BRICS is India. India is extremely pro-Israeli. The largest purchaser of Israeli weapons is India, and it's a member of BRICS.
You said that South Africa isn't sanctioned, but they are threatening you over land ownership issues. For example, white people in South Africa are only 7% of the population, yet they still, all these decades later, own 70% of the wealth and the land. It's surely South Africa's right to deal with land ownership in its own country without the threat of retribution from the US.
Absolutely, we have that right. But there's also lots of myths about this whole thing, George. So the act that was signed by the president recently, the Expropriation Act, as it's called, when you look at it, it's not unusual from similar acts in many parts of the world, including countries like the United States and various European countries. I mean, many countries have laws that allow the government to expropriate land that is, for example, abandoned. For various kinds of things. You want to build a highway, you want to build a hospital, you can expropriate land. You can compensate for the land, or if it is, for example, abandoned, then you don't. You can take it without compensation. These laws exist. They've existed in South Africa since at least the 1970s, during the apartheid era. So this is not new, it's not unusual, and it most definitely, in the law itself and in the way that it's been talked about, it's not targeting white people. You know, some of us think that maybe it should, but it's not. So that's the one kind of myth about this whole kind of white genocide rubbish that has come out from the white right wing in South Africa that Trump has bought into from his first term. But the second point I want to make, importantly, George, is that sometimes we exaggerate the threat as well. So what is the threat that the United States is making against South Africa? Number one, this idea that, you know, and Trump signed an executive order ending all aid to South Africa. Of course, by the time he signed the executive order, he had almost shut down USAID, so that aid had already stopped. But what is the aid? The vast majority of the aid to South Africa is through the PEPFAR program, the HIV/AIDS program. The South African HIV/AIDS program, 80% of it is funded by the South African government. About 10%, close to 10% funded by the Global Fund. PEPFAR funds 10 to 15% of it. And all of that money goes to NGOs. So yes, it's a huge problem. About 10 to 12,000 health workers are now don't have an income because of this. But these are health workers employed by various NGOs. And you know, what is required now is pressure on the South African government to fill that gap. But it's not a huge gap. About 10 to 12% or 15% of that budget has to be dealt with. It's not the whole program. That is what American aid to South Africa is. The other big thing, of course, they talk about is AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, and repeatedly threaten to kick South Africa out of AGOA or deprive South Africa of AGOA benefits. This kind of threat has been there for a good few years. Reached a high point in 2022 after South Africa's non-aligned position on the Ukraine issue, then took another peak after South Africa's ICJ case against Israel, and now with this whole expropriation rubbish has become a thing again. But what is AGOA? So a study done by Brookings, not a communist think tank, but a Democratic Party think tank in the United States, in 2023, just less than 2 years ago, found that if South Africa were kicked out of AGOA, didn't have any AGOA benefits, the impact on the South African economy, on its GDP, will be 0.06%. That in fact, the impact will be so minuscule that it won't make much of a difference to South Africa. However, they also said, if there was this to happen, if South Africa were deprived of AGOA benefits and South Africa wanted to retaliate or whatever, the United States could be in a bit of trouble, because a large part of their critical minerals they obtain from South Africa. So, for example, 97% of the chromium ores that the United States imports comes from South Africa. 37% of the platinum that they import comes from South Africa. They will not want to affect that. But we also are hearing now from businesses in the US, George, that they feel that no matter what happens with this AGOA thing and whatever else, that they will find ways of continuing to do business with South Africa as they have been. And business people, of course, for them, you know, it's the bottom line that matters, not all of this other stuff about politics and expropriation, etc. So these two big myths. Number one, how this land issue has been portrayed. And as you correctly said, 70% of the land still owned by white farmers is a serious indictment on us as a nation. And the expropriation thing is not targeting them. And the other myth about this massive impact, you know, the South African economy will crash if the Americans get upset. No, that's not going to happen.
And we know how much they love minerals. Na'eem, fascinating talking to you. Thanks for joining me on Have It Out with Galloway. Now, the unique feature of this show is that the audience can be seen as they have their say. Let's take the very first of our reports from Gaza, where Mohammed Al-Farah is going to update us.
Thank you guys so much for having me on today. It's actually a pleasure to be here. It's really appreciated. And it's important to shed light on the ongoing situation in Gaza, especially after the ceasefire, after the recent news of the ceasefire. While it has brought a temporary pause to the violence, the reality on the ground remains far from stable. The people of Gaza continue to face immense challenges. The airstrikes have subsided for now, but the threat is still present. as we see aircraft flying overhead regularly, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Furthermore, the border crossing have been unfortunately closed once again, severely restricting movement and making it even harder for the humanitarian aid to reach those in need, the displaced people and the families in Gaza Strip. The devastation caused by the conflict has left many families displaced and struggling to rebuild their lives once again. Access to essential services like healthcare, clean water, and education remains limited. Like for me, it's really hard to see our people are suffering, and actually there is no healthcare, there is no the essential services not available these days here in Gaza Strip. It's a fake ceasefire. It took me 2 hours to find a good place to get the internet connection to join this interview. I am now in Nasser Hospital to get the internet connection and the electricity. It's really tough. It's really hard, further exacerbating the suffering of Gaza's residents. While the ceasefire may have temporarily halted the active conflict, the human toll is still being felt. People are living on People are living in constant fear. Nothing happened. And the economy is in really bad situation with many businesses unable to operate due to damage or restrictions. It's really hard. However, the situation is far from resolved. It's really hard, but we continue to support our people in Gaza. Our people of Gaza, our families, our people are suffering. They are really do. We provided people, and we are still providing the people with the water, the tents, the toilets, the food, and the salt water, aka daily use water. So it's really hard, and we can't still provide the people with all of these things, with all of these aids. So I have nothing to say, nothing to be said, actually. It's really tough. I have just one message to the world. Like, what are you guys are waiting for? What are you guys are waiting for? Like, it's been more than 400 days, 450, 500. We lost the counts. Like, I swear, I don't know. We lost the counts. It's been too long. Nothing is happening. Like, the silence of the world's silence will kill us. We will die from the world's silence. So we have nothing to say, except I hope, and we all hope, this will end soon as possible, inshallah. I hope so. Thank you so much.
A devastating indictment of the situation in Gaza, to be sure, but I think an even more devastating indictment on the world. As he just said there, the fact that Israel could announce to the world that it is breaking the ceasefire, it is closing the gates, it is going to continue to occupy the Philadelphia corridor between Gaza and Egypt, and that no humanitarian aid is going to be allowed in, and not a single world leader, not the jokers who were gathered in London over Ukraine, not in the White House or in the Elysee or in Downing Street, nobody, not a single leader in the Western world even commented on what was the announcement of a war crime, punishable in a Nuremberg tribunal way, punishable, an actual war crime, announced. And they can't even find a word to say about it, never mind anything to do about it. Let's go to Michigan, where I hope to be very soon. Ronald Dwyer is on the line from there. Ronald, welcome to the show. What would you like to say?
Well, thank you, George, for having me on the show today, and just hearing this gentleman talk about Gaza. I appreciate, George, everything that you've been doing. I've been following you and how you've been speaking out for the Gaza people. I myself have quite a large following. I'm a politician in Michigan. I've taken a few punches, as you know, being an American politician, defending the Palestinians in Gaza. But it's the right thing to do. They are innocent people. They have a right to the land, and they are being slaughtered for defending their land. So my prayers go out to all the Palestinians in Gaza and those that are suffering right now in the West Bank. The same stuff is happening there. So, but my question kind of is, we're going back to South Africa with South Africa joining BRICS, becoming more of an influential member, and actually seems to be like really an emerging country there in South Africa, and actually taking a stand for the Palestinians, going to ICJ. Do you feel that with South Africa becoming a stronger member in BRICS, that perhaps we can maybe see some movement, some strength for the Palestinian people because of South Africa's voice getting a little bit stronger, being involved in BRICS? And then do you think Trump, seeing that BRICS is an emerging threat, is one of the reasons, too, why he's starting to play a little bit more nicer with Russia? I mean, he's had a good relationship with Putin, but he's quickly turned American relations with Russia around in just a matter of 5 weeks. We went from the Cold War back to having almost a partnership. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But first, I want to metaphorically take my hat off to you. It takes real guts to be a politician in the United States and to stand up for what's right on Palestine. So kudos to you. I hope we get to meet when my wife and I come to Dearborn sometime later this year. The Trump rapprochement with the United States may or may not continue. I think the key point to bear in mind about Donald Trump is not to pay attention to what he says, but to look at what he does. So on the optics level, you're right, it has been a tremendous, blistering progress. 5 weeks from the Cold War to meetings in Riyadh, meetings in Istanbul, re-establishing diplomatic relations, talking about an end to the war in Ukraine, but it hasn't happened yet. And some of these things that he talks about that we like may not happen. And some of the things that he talks about that we don't like also may not happen. His crazy Gaza plan, for example, with a Trump Tower and a casino and a bordello and God knows what else for rich Americans to holiday in. That, I can tell you, will never happen. And yet he took up so many hours of airtime to fantasize about it. Many people in the world think it's already a done deal that the Trump Tower is already, they've already broken ground with it. That won't happen. So I think the best policy with Trump is to wait and see what happens, rather than constantly listening to every, usually contradictory, and I've never met a man who can contradict himself so quickly and so often and so unembarrassed about it than Donald Trump. But for me, the number one issue in the world is stopping World War III. And that requires the United States and Russia to resolve the Ukrainian issue before it becomes World War III. There are many, many other issues of great importance to me. Gaza, Palestine, the Congo, all kinds of issues are really important, but none of them will matter a row of beans if the world goes up in nuclear smoke. So, insofar as Trump is serious about peace with Russia and an end to the war in Ukraine, I think we should get behind him on that question, if on no other. Many thanks for an excellent question. Maria Rasool is in my own old stamping ground of Glasgow in Scotland. Maria, welcome.
Hello, George. How are you? I hope you're well.
Thank you, by the grace of God, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And again, I want to echo what Ronald said. You know, I really appreciate you standing up for the Palestinian people. As a Muslim community, we appreciate, you know, everybody that is standing up, even like Ronald himself, that are struggling to be in power or to be a politician in their country. It really is an amazing thing to do. But my question is, again, going back to South Africa, with South Africa being the only nation filing the case of genocide against Israel via the ICJ that the United Nations, brushed under the carpet, can the nations in the global South realistically form their own international criminal court to police war crimes committed under the guise of self-defense or Western hegemony? I'm thinking in particular, along with South Africa, countries like we mentioned, China, Iran, possibly even Saudi Arabia.
Well, they definitely should, Maria, and to some extent they already have, but to a large extent they will probably not, for the reasons that Na'eem listed earlier. The United States is not a paper tiger. It's still a real tiger. It has fewer teeth than it had before, and there are other tigers, leaner, hungrier, more lithe. But the United States is still a tiger, and with its remaining teeth, it bites. So countries that formed a Global South International Criminal Court, for example, could expect to be, for the US to retaliate against them. If it were to indict, as undoubtedly it would, the crimes coming from the north of the globe, where most of the international crimes come from. South Africa took a very bold, brave, and principled step. I'm very proud of them as someone with history in that country. But the UN, as you put it brilliantly, just brushed it under the carpet. So if the highest court in the world has no ability to implement its judgments, then lesser courts in the Global South would have still fewer powers, abilities to do that. But I'm for anything and everything which increases cooperation in the world between the countries of the Global South, the Far East, as we like to call it, anything which increases the total volume of international cooperation out with the shadow of American hegemony. I'm in favor of doing it. This is the anniversary this year of the foundation of the Bandung Conference and the growth of the non-aligned movement, which came from it. My wife is Indonesian. We'll be going to Indonesia at some point to take part in those commemorations. It's a distant memory, if at all, for most people in the world now. But once upon a time, the non-aligned movement really was a thing. And if we could get back to that again, and if BRICS could develop into more of a non-aligned movement, that too would be a wonderful thing. Say hi to Glasgow for me, please. I was there at the weekend and realized how much I miss it. Riaz Mohammed is also in the UK, but in England, in Birmingham. Riaz, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you very much. It's my first time on. Really appreciate being able to comment. I just want to talk about Western hegemony. What challenges does the global face South in establishing a sustained alternative to Western-dominated economic and political systems?
Well, they have the money, they have the men, but they currently lack the resolve. And the main reason for that, as Na'eem said, is China. China is the biggest, the richest, the most populous, with the biggest army, with the biggest manufacturing economy. And although Na'eem said sometime in the next decade they'll have the biggest economy, I believe they have the biggest economy now. But it is characteristic of China to walk softly, to talk softly, until it's, in their judgment, the time to have the big reveal. And that mentality of caution on the part of China, frankly, holds back, for example, holds back the development of the BRICS, for example. I didn't want to say it, but Na'eem said it at Kazan. We hoped for progress, if not on a BRICS currency, at least on an alternative to the SWIFT system, which I believe to be absolutely imperative and also easy to do. If you and I agree on a way of settling your debt to me or my debt to you, no one can stop that. All it requires is a resolve to do so. But China holds so many American dollars, holds so many American bills, although it started to offload them now because, unbelievably, America's refusing to give China its own gold back, though it has repeatedly demanded it. Even more remarkable is that China has got gold in America, but that's perhaps another issue. God knows how they ended up in that situation. So China's very cautious because it is currently a beneficiary of the existing world financial system. And it might not be immediately to its benefit, but that will only last as long as the United States does not begin directly to bully China, using its control over the world financial system in order to do it. So I'm afraid we're waiting for Godot. We're waiting for the People's Republic of China to decide that its economic strength and its social, cultural strength, its international importance is going to be joined by its resolve to politically make its stand and politically make its mark in the world. And there's a kind of distance between those two things that we'll have to wait and see be filled. But that doesn't stop the rest of them trading in their own currency. They can do that, and they should, all of them, do that. Thank you for that call. Let's go to the US, to New Jersey, where Josh Dunn is on the line. Josh, what would you like to say, sir?
Thank you, George. I'm coming from the Coachella Valley, though, not New Jersey, though close, very close. Okay. You know, I was raised in the United States, and it's a country that is rife with racism. It was built and maintained on racism. And that's my personal inheritance as an American, right? Is this legacy. And it's been a problem that I've been working on for most of my adult life. Likewise, my connection to the Palestine issue is something that I've been working on, a solution to those problems, right? And that pursuit of solving those problems brought me to the international law. And I look at law like not a singular solution to a singular problem, but more like a proof or a theorem that describes a law of reality as it exists, right? As I try to make sense of all of the things happening internationally, I've come to rest on an idea that I call Mandela's Law. That I say we call it Mandela's Law because, you know, none of these ideas are you know, come about in, you know, spontaneously from an individual. They're ideas that people come up with in Congress, as it were, and then you know, someone ends up being the best person to express it, right? So this law, Mandela's Law, says that a state or the victim of genocide, which is a group, is entitled to land reparations from the perpetrator state, which is another group, if that state exists, irrespective of whether the victim is native to the land where the genocide took place. The law is intended to prevent states from being built or maintained, like this one, on genocide, and to provide an alternative to the kind of rule by brute force that we live under currently under the NATO Zionist regime, the post-Hiroshima, post-Nagasaki NATO Zionist regime that really betrayed us all at the end of World War II by replacing something that we hated with something that we hated just as much for basically the same reasons. Now, you knew Nelson Mandela. What do you think he would have to say about a Mandela's Law that went like that? And what do you as a NATO country, NATO nation politician think of it?
Well, I can't speak for Mandela, though I knew him well, but I'm sure he'd be honored to be associated with your law. Of course, there's many slip between cup and lip, and even in South Africa itself, as Na'eem just told us, the imbalance of land ownership is simply grotesque. All these years, decades after Mandela walked free from the dungeon of apartheid, and after unbroken ANC majority rule in the South African parliament with an ANC government, in large part staffed by the cadre that had led the liberation struggle. And even that government, with that majority, failed to bring about the kind of Mandela's Law compensation for genocide in South Africa. And now the ANC have lost their majority because of their failure to properly liberate the people from the other aspects of white domination of their country and their land. Sure, they got rid of many important things in the, if you like, the cosmetics of apartheid. Now, the idea of not being able to eat in the same restaurant or marry the person of your choice or go to the school that you want to, now all that is gone. But if the total domination of the real lives of the people is not achieved, then you haven't liberated them fully at all. And so we have a situation where in your continent and in mine and in the global south, justice has not yet prevailed. But I'm an optimistic person, and that I believe with God's will, justice will in the end, and haq, right, will reign throughout the earth. I'm sorry I can't answer you more fully and can't get to the other callers, but I promise if you come back next week, we'll bump you up the list and make sure you get your say. I've been George Galloway. This has been Have It Out with Galloway. Thanks for watching.